for obvious reasons, now is a good moment to consider one of the most brilliant commentaries on the papacy that's come out of the Catholic Church itself, and that is Dante's Divine Comedy, and what Dante makes particularly of the popes, the church, and what that might mean for Christianity in his time, and I think in ours. He is to encounter 7 popes on his famous journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. They will be Anastasius II, Adrian V, Nicholas III, Celestine V, Boniface VIII, and Clement V. Oh, and St. Peter. 5 are in hell, 1 is in purgatory, and only 1 is in paradise, that being St. Peter. And the condemnation of the papacy is extraordinarily strong. It really can't be overstated. As you'll see, it's almost embarrassing, awkward, uncomfortable for sure to rehearse what Dante says. And this partly springs from Dante's own political life, its rise, its failures, and his disillusionment at it all. But it's also a testament to the extent of the vision that he receives in the Divine Comedy, which he ends up saying came from no less than God, of course, but sanctioned particularly by St. Peter, the first pope, if you like. And so the significance of what Dante thinks he's doing in the Divine Comedy, when set against the church and the failures of its institutions, really is immense. And with people so conscious of how division, split, and the reduction of interest in Christianity in the West, or at least the sense that somehow the church is not presenting Christianity in a way that speaks to people's souls, what Dante had to say in the 14th century, the cusp of modernity, is still very much alive today. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's worth considering properly what Dante has to say. So the context for all this on Dante's part is in a time when the papacy is at the height of its temporal power and is hungry for more, as well as for material wealth. One of the images of the medieval papacy that Dante uses is of the sun and the moon, and the Pope is likening himself to the sun, the source of all light, whereas temporal power, the power of emperors and kings, is like the moon, which can only reflect the sun's light. And that says all you need to know in a way about the ordering in the Pope's mind, the Pope's minds that Dante condemns. But also this is in a time for Dante of really ineffectual monarchical leadership. The emperors in the German lands are failures. There are strong kings in France, but they too will be critiqued by Dante, although he himself seems to have longed for stronger monarchical rule. We'll come back to that. His own political life is one of the rise of his prominence in Florence. He becomes one of the friars of Florence, but then he has this terrible fall that leads to his exile and eventually a disillusionment with politics. And in many ways this makes him someone for our day as well, with the spread of disillusionment in political life. And he has something to say about that, which I think is very important. As the prior of Florence, the height of his own political power, he had himself condemned people, bankers, in a way that effectively led to their death. and in the Inferno he will meet the father of one of the people that he condemned, and so in effect killed, and it's a deeply uncomfortable moment for Dante. He is meeting his own failures in this system, as well as criticising so strongly the failures of others. But in his mortal life he also spoke very much against the Pope, who then became instrumental in his banishment from Florence. And it led to him really loathing not just individuals, but also Rome as a city and Florence as a city as well. Rome he always regarded as basking in its own sense of its own superiority, and you even get that to this day with the discomfort of, say, someone like Pope Francis, as he reportedly had in the city of Rome. And Florence too is condemned for its cultural vanity, for its terrible failure to maintain the virtues of its own origins. So let's turn to the journey itself and encounter the popes that he encounters and unpack further what this might all mean. It begins at the beginning of the Inferno, in the antechamber to hell. So this is the domain, a great cavern if you like, in which Dante encounters figures who made so little of their mortal life that they were just led by others, and he sees great crowds of people who are following someone holding a banner, but they're following unknowingly, and they're bothered instead by, literally by gnats, by flies, the minutiae of life, which in hell has become a great irritation, so that they're being bitten by these flies and pus is falling from the wounds, being eaten by worms on the ground. You get the sense of Dante's journey into hell right from the get-go, even here in a kind of antechamber. And it's here that he likely meets his first pope, often thought to be Celestine V. And there's not a direct reference to his name. There's a reference to one who made the great refusal, but it's quite widespread amongst commentators to liken this to Celestine V. And it's harsh, because Celestine, before becoming pope, had been a holy hermit and was brought to the papacy on great waves of hope that he would reform the corruption of the church. But within 6 months or so, he had resigned from the office, unable to make about the change, and had wanted to return to being a hermit. Dante sees this as a kind of cowardice, if indeed it is Celestine V who he sees in the antechamber. The one bit of Celestine's work, interestingly enough, that stands to this day is that it was he who issued the decree that meant that popes could resign, which of course has been used in more recent times. But Celestine himself sought to return to the hermit's life, and incidentally he was imprisoned by his successor, who we'll come to, fearing that Celestine might become the focus for a kind of anti-papacy papacy. So Celestine V, a tragic figure really, a holy figure, one who was unable to touch anything in the church of Dante's time. That is Dante's first comment on the papacy. The second pope that they encounter indirectly in hell is an early pope from the 5th century, Anastasius II, more than likely. And he was remembered, particularly in Dante's time, for being a schismatic. They are hiding behind the tomb of Anastasius II in the Inferno. Virgil and Dante have to pause at this particular point because the stench that's coming up from the depths of hell is absolutely overwhelming, and they need to take some time to acclimatise. And incidentally, it's in this particular point that Virgil explains to Dante the outline of hell, the kind of structure that it follows, and it's very significant that what Virgil refers to is the wisdom of Aristotle, the pagan figure, the one whom the Muslims, the great enemies of the medieval church, call the first teacher, Virgil is using Aristotle's insights to describe to Dante, at least at a first pass, what he will see and encounter. And they do so behind this great monumental tomb of Anastasius II. He is one of the only popes in the early church who was never made a saint, because he was thought to have advocated the heresy that Christ was human only and not fully divine, so had left the true path. A second pope who does not come out well in Dante's telling. Now, the third and fourth popes whom they encounter come a little later in the 19th canto of the Inferno, and here we enter the realm of the simoniacs. Simoniacs are those people who sell church offices or church blessings, church indulgences, of course, for money. They pervert what comes from God by turning it into gold. And it's here that Dante meets particularly Nicholas III and his great enemy, Boniface VIII. Now, Nicholas III is already in hell, but in the time that Dante sets his journey, Boniface VIII hasn't yet died, but Nicholas III prophesies that Boniface VIII will join him here. And it's in this now famous image of the inverted popes. So he depicts Boniface III as turned upside down. He says it's like a baptismal font that has become a prison, and instead of the waters of blessing and salvation that baptism can give, this pope is experiencing the fire of condemnation, and the spirit that might have burnt brightly on his head is now burning on his feet and torturing him for seemingly all eternity. This Nicholas III is speaking to Dante, but doesn't realise it's Dante the Pilgrim. He thinks actually it's already Boniface VIII arrived early. And it's very striking how Dante even portrays his standing alongside the Pope, because he says it was a bit like a friar who hears a confession. And this is referring to the practice of killing people by burying them alive, head in the ground. And what happened was that a friar had to listen to the very last words of the condemned, just in case they confessed. And so that confession could be recorded. And Dante, therefore, is likening himself to someone who's trying to hear whether, even in extremis, this Pope, Nicholas, might confess his sins. And of course he doesn't. He does precisely the opposite. He's entirely locked in his simoniac perversion of what the church might offer to people. This leads to reflections on this great enemy of Dante, Boniface VIII, and it's one of the moments where it really could hardly be stronger. Nicholas says that Boniface has deceived his bride, the church, in order to steal this marriage, to secure his position as Pope, and then moreover, if that wasn't worse, bad enough, he then pimps her. He sells her like a common whore. And this theme about the church and whoredom is one that Dante will return to. Just a little bit about Boniface VIII in history. He is not a great figure. He signs a papal bull saying that all temporal power on earth must be subject to spiritual authority, therefore trying to secure and pin down this great tussle that the medieval church had had with temporal power, who had the right to give temporal power and who therefore was superior even to temporal power. And the implication is that Dante really feels that if the church is to make any headway, it needs to withdraw from temporal power completely. Boniface also issues a decree that Dante sees as very much against the role of women in the life of holiness, the path to God, union with the divine, because Boniface issues this decree that requires nuns to stay in cloisters and severely restricts the power of abbesses. Whereas Dante, as becomes clear in the Paradise, increasingly takes his wisdom from women, Beatrice famously, of course, St. Lucy, the Virgin Mary, but the figures that appear to him as he comes closer and closer to God are increasingly women. And he therefore is implying that whilst priests claim to administer salvation through the offices of the church, it's really women who will bring you to God. He lives in the time particularly of the beguines, this extraordinary uprising, particularly of women in the medieval period. And Dante is very much aligning himself with the beguine women, as well as with other kind of irregular characters in the medieval life of the church, particularly the friars, who we'll come to as well. But another reason why he thinks Boniface is so deeply and profoundly wrong. If you want relationship with God, the church is as likely to deceive you and pimp you as lead you. Boniface also enforces the idea that there's no salvation outside of the church, this doctrine which was actually rescinded by Vatican II. But Dante is already complaining and condemning that idea that salvation is only found within the church, because again, when he gets to paradise, even in the purgatory actually, he sees increasingly figures who are saved but are pagan, are Jewish, are Roman. And it's another way in which he is not just attacking Boniface VIII, but is showing why Boniface VIII was so deeply wrong. Another detail in this encounter with Nicholas III, the condemnation of Boniface VIII, that's interesting given our times, is that Boniface had abused the icon that was so beloved by Pope Francis. This is the icon purportedly painted by St. Luke of Mary and the Christ child. And what Boniface had done was he processed this icon through the Arch of Titus in Rome on the feast of the Eve of the Assumption. And what Boniface was doing through this gesture was likening himself to Titus, and so saying that the Pope was the natural inheritor of the emperors of Rome, not the kings of France, not the Holy Roman emperors. And so again, it's a symbolic aligning of Boniface with temporal power that's at once abusing this image of Mary and Christ. As if Boniface is saying Mary and Christ acknowledge my temporal power too, and so completely inverting and pimping the Christian story for his own temporal ends. I say this just to show how, even at this stage, and it gets worse actually, Dante's condemnation of the Pope really could hardly be stronger. By way of contrast, in the Paradise, he will celebrate St. Francis, a figure who comes in a generation or two before Dante. And the point about St. Francis, apart from everything else, is that Francis completely gives up any temporal power that he might have, his wealth and so on, and is celebrated as the one who, only the other person since Christ ever to have done this, marries Lady Poverty. And that is seen as the great sign in Dante's eyes, as he is one who follows. It's also at this point in the Inferno that Dante makes the first of several condemnations of a document that was known as the Donation of Constantine. Comes in the Inferno, the Purgatory and the Paradise, this. And this is now recognised to have been a false document, but nonetheless at the time was believed to be the document by which the Roman emperor secured papal power on earth, gave the Pope the papal lands, given to Pope Sylvester in the 4th century, Dante believed, and he therefore refers to Pope Sylvester as the first rich father for receiving the donation of Constantine. And Dante sees this as securing the disaster that became the medieval papacy, so far as he sees it in relation to Christianity. And of course, it's still much discussed whether the baptism of Constantine led to the Latin Church, the Western Church's failures. Dante is in line with that criticism, not so much through the baptism of Constantine himself, but what happened subsequently when Pope Sylvester received from a subsequent emperor this document that purported legally to give them temporal power and the papal lands. Now, after this encounter with Nicholas III and Boniface VIII, Virgil has to carry Dante away, and I think this symbolises two things. One is that Dante's rage at what he hears Nicholas III say, and the awakening of his rage against Boniface VIII, who had caused his banishment from Florence, consumes him as well in this moment in the Inferno. His immortal soul is at risk because of what the popes stir up in him. He must condemn the popes, but he must nonetheless also take responsibility for himself, and he almost can't do that. And so Virgil carries him from this encounter. But of course it's also very significant because Virgil is described as Dante's mother in this moment. The church should be Dante's mother, and it has failed him, and the pagan Virgil is Dante's mother in this moment, and so lifts him out of this moment of existential crisis and existential risk for Dante. So much for Dante's encounters with the popes in hell. When it comes to the purgatory, there is a meeting with one pope, and this is Adrian V, whom Dante meets on the terrace normally referred to as the terrace of the avaricious and the profligate on Mount Purgatory. You'll remember that after the lower slopes of Mount Purgatory, Dante and Virgil enter through a gate and begin the work of purgatory proper, which is not about purging your bad bits, but it is about purging that which veils your that veils your understanding of God, that leads to your ignorance, so that your whole self can be restored to its rightful divine form. And this is what he meets Adrian V doing. A pope who had only been on the papal throne for 38 days. He died very soon after being made pope. But what Adrian tells Dante in this moment is that he had an overwhelming desire in his life to climb the greasy pole of church power. He had a lust for power, you might say, rather than a lust for gold. But it's when he reached the top, when he became pope, that he realised that it was as all for nothing. It did not deliver him peace. It did not deliver him knowledge of God. And so he says that he converted in that moment. Again, an extraordinary image. A pope who converts to Christianity at the last, not having been Christian in his own eyes before. He switches from the secondary goods of this world and realises that there's only one primary good, namely God. And this is stressed because Dante moves to acknowledge Adrian as if still pope in purgatory, and Adrian says, no, there's no popes here, no popes in the afterlife. I'm just one person with you, atoning for what I got wrong in life and readying myself, therefore, for the destination with God in the paradise. So, in this one pope that Dante meets in purgatory, there's a different kind of quality of soul, for sure. This is not a Nicholas III or a Boniface VIII, trapped by their own pimpery in the Inferno. But nonetheless, this is a pope who's saying, really, there are no popes, certainly in the afterlife. And if you bow before me, then you are really colluding with the mistake that I made in life, with the lust for power. And how that was recovered, he recovered from that, Adrian says, only because he converted to Christianity properly after having become pope. Now, it's also in purgatory that Dante reaches the top of the mountain and enters the region known as the earthly Eden. And this is significant for his criticism of the papacy in another way. For one thing, his first guide in the earthly Eden is a figure who is called Matilda, and she is widely recognised now, I think, as being a beguine woman, one of the figures who lived in Dante's time, showing the true way. And it's also in Eden that Dante receives a great vision after Beatrice has appeared. So Beatrice appears to Dante on a chariot pulled by a griffin, and a griffin is part eagle, part lion, so has two natures in one person, and so represents Christ. But what happens is that Beatrice vacates the chariot, and then the chariot is invaded by 7 animals, creatures, figures, and what this is a kind of anti-pageant that describes to Dante what has gone wrong with the church, what has gone wrong with Christianity since its inception. And Dante's told that he must record everything he sees, even if he doesn't understand it, by Beatrice. But the culmination of this quite complicated scene is when a whore and a giant occupy the chariot. And this is widely recognised as reference to the whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation, and a giant who, as Dorothy L. Sayers describes it in her commentary and her translation, is a kind of monstrous human, a mass of undigested emotion, and so unable to control themselves, unable to see clearly, unable to know of their true nature. And in Dante's vision, the whore and the giant kiss, but then he beats her and leads her, drags her into the darkness of the forest that's behind them. And so the implication is that this is what happens to the church when it's tied to political power. It is fornicating, it gets dragged into the darkness. Again, in the most dramatic way, loses its way. Dante says that he's a child of the church and yet condemns it so boldly. He is a reformer, before the Reformation. It's worth remembering that the criticisms of the Catholic Church extend way back into the medieval and early modern period, a long time before the 16th century, and Luther finally arrives and precipitates the change that had been building for centuries. And Dante is very much part of that. He also hates indulgences like Luther. He visits Rome in the year of the first Jubilee, 1300, and immediately sees that this is just being called by Boniface to raise money in order to build what actually is now the Basilica of St. Peter's, the new St. Peter's. And Dante describes the Jubilee as literally a time to rake money from people. He describes priests with rakes, literally not able to scoop up the coins that the people have left because the Jubilee year has promised them release from condemnation. A lot of the criticisms that Luther so crystallised are made by Dante in the Divine Comedy. He is a kind of anti-establishment figure, I think. There's no doubt about that, and even for that Reformed Catholic Church, the Church of England that emerged after the Reformation, the same kind of critique would be made, that even if you feel your presence in political structures is benign, you're too at risk of destroying and certainly perverting the calling of what the church might be. But let's come to paradise. Happier moments, or is it, for the papacy? Dante encounters Peter, particularly St. Peter, as he's guided by Beatrice. But Peter too, and again the shock of this, an apostle in paradise, still condemns the church and the papacy in a way that, again, you can't overstate. Peter actually says that the seat of Rome is empty. He says that Rome has become a city of blood and filth with which Satan himself is pleased. Here's what he has to say. He says, "He who on earth usurps my place," i.e. who claims to be the successor of Peter, the Pope, my place that in the sight of God's own Son is vacant now, has made my burial ground a sewer of blood, a sewer of stench, so that the perverse one who fell from heaven, Satan, here above, can find contentment there below. It gives Satan succour, the way that the papacy and the church is, not the saved. Peter also goes on to say that the Pope drinks his blood, Peter, who was martyred, who spilt his blood for the sake of the church, presumably. Now the Pope is drinking that blood. Another just extraordinary image of the debauchery that Dante sees. Beatrice chips in as well, and it's, again, quite uncomfortable to say, but Beatrice's last words in paradise, after all she had shown Dante, after all she had guided him into, the beauty of her eyes, the loveliness of her smile, the wisdom of her voice, her presence which had readied Dante and drawn him more and more into the paradisal light, to the recognition of the fullness of what Christianity promises. Here, her last words in the high heavens are to condemn a pope, this time Clement V, who too, she says, will be with the Simoniacs in the Inferno. You know, her last words are ugly even, as she is beautiful, when she says, "But God will not endure him long within the holy ministry." This is Clement V. "He shall be cast down there where Simon Magnus," the Simoniacs, "pays. He shall force the Anagnine," that's referring to Boniface VIII, "deeper in his hole." So you might say that the only popes who aren't wholly bad and who feature in Dante's Divine Comedy are popes whose time was cut short, either because they resigned or because they died, and cut very short. You know, we're talking just weeks, a few short months here. The condemnation of particular popes is enormously strong. Dante doesn't just put it in his own voice, he puts it into the mouth of Saint Peter. And it's not just particular popes, I think. I think the condemnation of the papacy is also explicit. Scholars discuss this. Dante does say he's a child of the church, but it's so strong that it's not just individuals who are condemned as if they're the bad apples. No, the whole barrel has become corrupt, I think Dante is saying. So it's worth asking, you know, what does this mean politically and also ecclesiastically? Well, politically, I think it means that Dante came to the view that the task in this life is to be in the world, but not of it. He uses this formula which you see in the Gospels, in Paul's letters. And what that means in practice is arguing for a kind of minimalist politics, a politics that doesn't get above what it really can hope to achieve. It should provide a steady, stable enough container for God's work on earth to be done, particularly in the lives and the souls of the people. He's like William Blake here in this, I think. Blake too said that politics has lost sight of what he called the golden road, and that politics needs to recognise is that things always rise and fall in political life, but that can be tolerated, even welcomed, because behind any particular political moment is this broader goal that's probably being realised more and more in the hearts of people rather than in society as a whole, which is readying them in this world for the world that is to come. Even Dante says the Roman emperors understood something of this. He talks about how Christ was condemned during his earthly life, leading of course to his crucifixion, and that was at least sanctioned by the authority of the Roman Empire through the person of Pontius Pilate, of course. So even that dark moment was in a way an example of how politics can do God's work even in the darkness. So I suppose what that's saying is that even when politics goes horribly wrong, God is still at work in the world, because God of course is in the world but not of the world as well. I think it's also must be saying that our happiness should not ultimately be tied to social conditions, to how politics is going in our time, partly because that's so unreliable and transient, but also because it removes from within us the eternal focus that we should have. We should be in the world but not of the world too. You might say that Dante is very anti-Marxist before Marx, of course. But he is saying that economic explanations for who we are, social explanations for who we are, they are going to be illuminating to a degree, but if they're taken as the whole story, they're going to lose sight of the transcendent horizon that is before us all, regardless of earthly conditions. You might say that Dante, of course, arrived at this conclusion because his mortal political life on paper went so horribly wrong. But I think that that tragedy leads to this wider realization. He did advocate a kind of benign monarchy, in a way a bit like a kind of ideal Taoist ruler who rules but in such a way that you don't even know that that's happening, because what the rule provides is a stability from within which you can live a life that works out your own salvation. But Dante was disappointed even in that. He talked about a figure from the French lands, Henry VII, who did come to the fore but then failed to work on temporal happiness as reasonably as you can, but don't cling to temporal happiness because it will be taken from you. Dante has a conversation with his ancestor Cacciaguida in the heaven of Mars in the paradise, and that's sort of what Cacciaguida tells him. Instead, work on that which provides lasting, eternal happiness. And that way you can provide yourself, find, discover, receive some stability even amidst the turmoil of earthly life. So much for Dante's politics, a good enough politics if you like. But what about his argument with the church and Christianity? What does that mean? Well, this is the way I put it in my own book on the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey. This is the kind of conclusion I have come to, that Dante was advocating what might be called a Christianity beyond Christianity. He could criticize the church, he could do so with good theological and spiritual reasons as well as political and temporal ones. But I think he always knew that things were going to fail in this life, and that though could become a place from which to always be ready to receive that which will come from what will ultimately know in the next life, but that transcendence is also imminent in this life too. That is the path of the mystic. That's what the beguines would have taught him. That's what he saw in the life of someone like St. Francis. And so, this is how I put it. And I'm referring here to what St. Peter tells Dante. So, the highest ecclesiastical authority Dante is claiming for his own voice here. It comes in this moment in the high heavens of paradise, almost towards the end of the Divine Comedy, when St. Peter speaks at the last and launches into a long, extended, wholehearted invective against the institution that had become so preoccupied really with its own concerns that even though it claimed to be standing for divine life, just had no idea what divine life really was about, and so had forgotten its own survival, its own glory, its own wealth, its own voice mattered more than God's. And what Dante sees in this moment, even amidst the ecstasy of paradise, is therefore just completely unknown to the priests and the prelates. Again, his tirade could hardly be put more strongly. Peter saying that he had shed his blood to realise the joy of heaven on earth, and the medieval church is just drinking that blood. It's cannibalising itself, you might say, in order to indulge its ignorance, its corruption, its petty, degenerate impulses. But Peter goes further, because Peter also cries to God. He prays to God, asking God, why do you hold back? Why do you allow this state of affairs to continue? Why don't you intervene? Why don't you reform? It's so remarkable, because here in paradise, Peter knows to some significant degree the mind of God. That's partly what it is to be in paradise. He sees the divine wisdom, and still he cries out to God. So what's this about? And I think that the fourfold interpretation of the Divine Comedy that Dante himself explains, the literal, the allegorical, the tropological and the anagogic, there's 4 levels in which the text can work on us, is illuminating here. So literally, in this moment, Peter is the human being who gave his life for the cause, as it were, and now sees it dishonoured. And so his calling out to God is an expression, literally, of his distress and rage, and that still has a place even in paradise. But unlike in hell, where Dante had got caught up in his distress and rage and had to be carried away by Virgil, his mother, in that moment, there's more now going on for Peter in paradise, because this has also got an allegorical moment as well. This is Peter the saint who yearns for change, for right to be restored, for delight to be spread once more. And he expresses that as his heartfelt desire in his cry to God. But it doesn't stop there, because also paradise is this place of continual realization, of infinite, everlasting, never-ending journeying into God. And so that is in this moment where Peter cries out as well, the tropological element. Peter, who understands divine ways, who sees God's intelligence, cries out so that we too can be brought into the realization of that intelligence, to think through what it might actually take to bring about change on earth, in the church, in the understanding of Christianity. God is doing that. And so in that moment, Peter is drawing Dante and we readers into that as well. God's doing what God always does, of course, radiating divine abundance. But the question is, how can Christianity know of that divine abundance more? Peter is drawing Dante into that in the writing of the Divine Comedy, us too as readers. Which leads to the 4th level, the anagogic, of course, which is seeing from the divine perspective. How can he, how can we, how can how can Dante identify with that, align with it, participate in this divine life? And that's ultimately the reason why Dante hears Peter's condemnation here, even in paradise. There's no need, as it were, for another rehearsal of ecclesiastical failures. Dante's done that very much in the strongest possible way. But why is it heard in the high heavens? And Peter shows how this is still part of the realization of the God as his oration continues. He argues, I think, that there may be a secular solution. He talks about a great leader that will come. People shouldn't give up on that hope. And in fact, Peter in this moment refers to the Roman Empire again, the pagan period, and the Pax Romana. It is possible to live in times of peace politically. The pagans achieved it. You know, the significance of that when speaking in medieval Christian times. So one shouldn't give up on that hope. But there is more always to hope for when politics fails. And this is what Peter leaves Dante with. He addresses Dante the pilgrim directly, which then Dante the poet conveys to us. He says, "You, Dante, must return to earth and not hold back from telling what you have seen, experienced, and heard. You must repeat the words that you've heard spoken. Put aside anything that seems unacceptable, that seems awkward, difficult, even will put you at risk in the expressing of them. Be the prophet, be the herald of a new spirit, be the container for a new incarnation, even in your own person, that all people might know that new incarnation too." And this is my take on Dante's calling. He is realizing his vocation to follow Christ and be, insofar as he can, open to the divine presence, a conduit, a portal for God's presence in the world. His poem will be part of a new dispensation. This was spoken about by Beatrice on the top of Mount Purgatory in the earthly Eden, and it's repeated now by Peter in paradise. His work resonates, I think, with other movements at the time. initiated, say, by the friars, Francis and Dominic. Francis particularly, who had married Lady Poverty, Dominic, whose wisdom saw clearly, Dante also says, as well as by the injection of new intellectual life, I think, that was coming from the Islamic traditions. Aristotle is used by Dante, that had come into Christian Europe through Islamic Europe. Dante is saying that too can be part of the restoration, using the insight and wisdom that maybe gets better held outside of Christianity. We as Christians should be alert to that. He sees through the nostrums of his age, therefore, I think, towards a Christianity beyond Christianity. He works out how to be in the world but not of it, and how to speak of the gospel even through the distortions of the gospel that are so present around him. That can be recovered. The heart of it never dies, even if it seems to have done. There can always be an expanded vision. There's always God's activity to align to. The roles of the Pope, the roles of the Church in this, well, that is always moot. It's got to be judged, discerned, moment by moment. They're kind of inevitable, possibly even necessary. I think Dante's ambivalent about that. Facets of religious life. But I think Dante's message is, if you as an individual rely wholly on what the church tells you, you are going to be subject to the way the church can grow in ignorance, how it can even actively distort things. Whereas what Dante is arguing is that we must ultimately take responsibility for our own salvation, our own relationship with the divine, our own realization of that in life. The saints, in Dante's view, are the figures like Beatrice, like St. Lucy, like the Virgin, of course, the beguines like Matilda, the figures like Francis, who did that, who did stand implicitly or explicitly against what was going so wrong, but didn't let that consume them as well, the risk that Dante had faced in the Inferno. He says, in a way, we should be like Pope Adrian V, the one that he meets in purgatory, who even when he had ascended the greasy pole of papal power, still had just enough in him to convert at that moment and to give it up. And then we might realise the universal vision of Christianity. Remember, it's pagans who teach Dante this as much as anyone else. All will be saved, Dante is saying, even though he's seen right into the heart of darkness, because at the end of the day, at the end of time, the only thing that sustains us in being is, as Dante famously concludes at the end of the Paradise, the love that moves the sun and the other stars.